Douglas, is it more virulent nowadays then than 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 50 years ago?
What?
Anti-Americanism in Europe, anti-Europeanism in America.
Well, I mean, it's been talked up a lot, yeah. And there are people with an interest in talking it up. It should be stated. Once, for instance, you've written a book saying Europe is in decline, you kind of have a vested interest in it declining, otherwise you'll prove to be an idiot at parties. And vice versa, if you keep on saying that America is the authoritarian Nazi state without parallel in human history, then you kind of have an interest in hoping that American civil liberties are further taken away, and that the hope that you'll be proved right in your fatuous thesis. But what I think is happening at the moment is we do have a few people on each side who have kind of blown the ground open a bit. I mean, back to yours, Eurabia is one example, Mark Stein's latest book, America Alone, and then all, of course, of the putrid effusions of Noam Chomsky and co. on the other side. So, you know, the ground's very open, and there's a lot of room in the middle now, and most people are there, but sadly, as always, the louder you shout, the more you get listened to, and the wackier your thesis, the more press you're going to get.
Some of the other candidates of pushing America, wanting to pull America towards Europe. He was saying that as an insult.
It would be an insult. I mean, it is an insult. It would be a dreadful thing if America was pulled in any way towards Europe, in which, incidentally, I don't particularly include Britain. But it would be a dreadful thing. I mean, a lot of American commentators are right on this. I mean, as we know, I mean, Europe as a continent.
So there is some truth in this.
Yeah, I mean, Europe as a continent is typified currently by very second-rate politicians running it on a strange consensus of the centre-left, which they don't seem to question at any point. They seem to regard the future as being an inevitable state in some sort of hinterland where one pays more and more taxes in order that they can distribute our money worse and worse. And there's no questioning of that. That's just what's going to happen. And we'll be safer and cuddlier and more secure and happier if this happens. It's a societal project. I mean, it can't be stressed enough that the other things that used to fill up these gaps, the church and so on, have in Europe seen a decline which isn't irreversible, but is undoubtedly there, and where the elites of Europe decide not to refer to our heritage and our past in their constitution. I mean, this is an important one, for instance, on the European Constitution. Yeah. You can write the American Constitution, you can carry the American Constitution, I know a lot of people who do, round in your pocket. If you tried to carry the EU Constitution around for any time, you'd break your back. This is a document of incredible fatuity, and it can't be stressed enough that America still is built on ideas and on dreams and on prospects, which you can see still, and I know it's a cliche, but you can see it in your recently arrived American immigrant who believes that tomorrow is going to be a better day than today, and that if they have one taxi car today, next month they might have two, and by 10 years from now they might have a chain. And you compare that with general perceptions, and all polling seems to be as happening in Europe. If you just ask polls in Europe, if you ask people in a poll in Europe whether they believe, for instance, that tomorrow is going to be a better day, or whether they're going to be better off next year than today, of course they don't. Why should they? They're going to be taxed more next year. They're going to have their societies falling apart a bit more next year. They're going to have less and less social cohesion next year.
Rather than suggesting that continents are monolithic and that Europe now represents a sort of degraded moral
I'll tell you,
state.
Far, far from it. Continents are not monolithic anymore, and Europe is describing how not monolithic they are, because Europe 20 years from now is going to look very, very different from Europe today and very different from Europe of 50 years ago. This is part of the problem. Part of the problem is that Americans used to know what they could rely on in Europe. They used to typify certain countries. You used to say, France will have these characteristics and that characteristics.
Well,
you can't
say that.
Yeah, well, they do. But you can't say, you won't be able to say what France is going to behave like in 20 years' time. You won't be able to say that it'll be the same suspicious way that in which it behaves at present. The continent of Europe is changing in such major ways because of demographics, because people aren't having enough children, because of the incredible, overwhelming immigration which has happened way beyond any scale which any of the societies in Europe can cope with that have had to put up with it. And so the truth is that what America used to believe was its ally continent, or countries which it understood, has now slipped away. And I don't think anyone's going to be able to get that back again.
But is Europe lost? I mean, Douglas has made the point that in 20 years, in his view, Europe will be lost, or changed at the very... I mean, changed or lost. Would you use the term lost?
We might not have thought in the past that
would you use it lost, though? Yes.
No, it's not yet lost, but it could be. But we used to talk in the past about what the Elysee would behave like, what what the French foreign ministry would do and things. I don't think we'd have ever guessed, say 50 years ago, that we would come to a point where the French president effectively doesn't have that much control over his, or indeed any control over his foreign policy in, say, the Middle East, because he has such a huge 10% of his population which is radicalized and willing to turn out onto the streets if he supports a war or argues for something which they don't agree with. It's undoubtedly it's going to change your society, it's going to change your cabinet, it's going to change the way you run politics. And really, you can't pretend it won't, because, I mean, you see someone like Jack Straw has a very large Muslim community in his constituency, which is going to be growing. That's going to change the way people like him vote. If you're going to stand in Jack Straw's constituency at the next election, you better make sure that you're not a raving pro-Zionist neocon.
But to take the case of Jack Straw, of course, he stood up and made the case about face veils because he was so worried about it, because he was encountering it in his constituency. I think what will happen is that, I mean, I agree, it's important that people talk about this and they realise that in France, those cities where there are those issues in the banlieue, in Holland, where there's going to be the issue of Muslim majorities in some of their cities really very soon, these are important things that we talk about. But to suggest that it's all going to fall away...
Well, if it's not going to fall away, what are we going to do?
What I'm saying is, I think that there's a... we talk about it in terms of demographics, and it suggests that it's about majorities. It's not. It's a problem of a kind of fascism. And as it's a kind of fascism, it's about a minority who use brutality and violence to control the majority. So it's about putting down a small number of people who are very dangerous. And I think it's important to characterise it that way, instead of a flood of people overwhelming us.
The point is that your small minority plays to a larger and larger home pool.
I don't deny it's a problem, but I just think that it's important that we're going to have to deal with it.
But what are you going to do to deal with it?
We can't
tell America that Europe's nearly lost, or that it's quite a bit away from being lost, or that we're in a really bad state, unless we have some kind of answer. We can't play that game. Either we know what we're going to do to stop it, or we should tell them that we're moving over quite soon.
But Britain has been doing well, I think.
Give me the green card.
Yes.
Saying Europe is lost doesn't seem to me to be particularly productive.
The question of our values is an important one, which we should come back to. I mean, my point about the American Constitution is, if you can't put your values pretty much on one piece of paper, if you need thousands of pages, I'm suspicious that you might not have any values, and this might be padding. I mean, you know, it seems to me, and it's very much the case in Britain at the moment, that our values are such, the things that we know we believe in, or believed in, the institutions of state, the rule of law, the monarchy, the church, all of these great things that made Britain have one by one been attacked. The education system, further education, our collegiate systems have one by one been attacked. And more than that, more importantly than that, people who say they support them feel slightly embarrassed as they do so. I mean, Orwell pointed this out 60 years ago, so part of it isn't new. But the notion that you can't stand up for any of your values, and that if I asked the average person on the continent of Europe, what do you believe in, the likelihood would be either that one would be, one is, brought back with a sense of either cynicism, that there are no particular values, or dumbfounded incomprehension. People are embarrassed by it. That's not something you find in America, and I'm not surprised that Americans are suspicious of Europeans when they can't even say what they stand for.
Okay.
Yeah, but we come back to the point of what are you going to do to challenge them? And it's all very well for Europeans to talk about standing for their values. But in recent years in particular, they've proved very bad at standing for those values. Every time, for instance, freedom of speech issues have come up in this continent, if I include Britain in Europe for a moment, we failed badly. Every time, I mean, you know, you would not find a case analogous to that which has happened in most European countries now, where writers have been prosecuted. I'm thinking of Oriana Fallaci in Italy, I'm thinking of Michael Houellebecq in France, I'm thinking of Fallaci again in France. You wouldn't find these cases in America, and if you did, they'd be chucked out of court. Europeans are proving very bad at defending those values, and when it comes to religious belief, which they're not even willing to put into their constitution and acknowledge their own history on it, you can't help finding again and again in the people who are telling them to find themselves, you find non-believing atheist Jews and Christians and so on saying that Europe has to re-find its soul. You go, as if religion is once again just something like Voltaire says, for the servants, as if it's for other people, but of course I don't believe that rubbish.
One thing to remember about Iran is how pro-American it is. Indeed, I mean, we may have all sorts of issues in Europe, but in terms
rolling
of
his eye.
No, in the mass of Iranians, I think there is a great deal of pro-American sentiment. I agree that there's a horrible problem with a regime, but...
No, I roll my eyes merely because it's what we've heard for decades.
And actually,
when are we going to see them?
I think we'll see them when the regime goes. I'm not saying...
Which will be when?
Well, it depends when George Bush's
my point is that the egg timer of the extremists being kicked out of office by this pro-American surge...
Oh, I'm not saying that.
It seems to me to be too far away.
Yes,
I've been promised it for a long time.
Yes, I think it'll probably come to bombs falling on nuclear programs before then, but... in the long run.
One hopes...
Do you want to do my story next? My story is related to that.
I think it is. Bring in your story.
Because I was going to cite as my story of the week a very, very interesting and good piece by Daniel Pipes in yesterday's New York Sun, extending bringing to a greater public notice the work of two young American scholars about Israel's capability to strike Iran's nuclear reactors, which really, I think, changes the power play in the region over this one, because it's always been assumed, or it's been assumed for a couple of years now, since talk has been going on about taking out Iran's nascent nuclear project, that Israel, as it were, couldn't go it alone. And this article by Daniel Pipes yesterday, based on this research, shows that actually Israel can certainly go it alone. It has the capabilities. It has, of course, we know the planes, but it turns out that various of the missiles needed, it's been war-gamed and it would work. And what's more, the suggestion is made that if they can fly along the borders of, say, Saudi and so on, neither country needs to object. So whether or not they'll do it, I think it's unlikely. But it's a very important story, I think, because one of the presumptions which Tehran will be making and many of the other powers in the region about Israel's inability to act alone has just been busted. And I think that the necessary pressure that needs to be put on Iran can really be heightened at this point. If Israel can go it alone, if it can do it without America, then I hope Iran sits up and takes notice.
Ben, do you share this optimism about this article and this study?
I defer to Mark, and I will come back to you.
Yes, I was going to bring in another story which I wasn't going to talk about, but in relation to this I think is very interesting. Of course, America and Israel have been wargaming just this weekend, I think.
Everyone, the point now, everyone should war game all the time. It's what Defence Department's meant to do.
They work together.
Paris is war game.
No, but they've been doing a major co-military exercise, which has been also timed in with Israel launching a new military satellite. So I think they're certainly at least trying to frighten Tehran.
Just point out that in this case, if there are indeed these Democrats in Iran, we need to see them. We need to see them, they need to speak louder. And just finally, on the point of the funding, the $70 million from Washington, yeah, they announced it publicly. Yes, that's not a great idea. But on the other hand, you can rely absolutely on the fact that if they hadn't announced it, the New York Times would have bust the story a little bit later and broken it against all national security interests, and it would have been inevitable. It would have found the way on the front page that way. So maybe you just announce it before the New York Times does.
We're going to have to cut you off there.
That's fine. I'm not sure it warrants a response.
At that point. Well, look, that was their view as usual. This was Worldview.